And so the enemy pilot dies the death that his stupidity deserved. If you must charge towards an aircraft, do it at an angle.
Greetings all, I'm Nicholas Moran. I commissioned as an armor officer for M1 tanks and then converted to M3 Bradleys. These days I work as a civilian vehicle historian, primarily for World of Tanks. I'm back again to rate tank battles on movies and TV and judge how real they are.
The Ripsaw, which was basically a tracked toy for people to drive around in. It looks just like it does in the movie here. It's because it had such lightweight and such a high powered weight ratio, the thing is incredibly fast and incredibly nimble, which of course attracts the attention of the military. We say, well, hang on a second, we've got this vehicle that can go anywhere really, really quickly. Can we do something with it? But the variant that the Army has been looking at of late is actually a robotic combat vehicle. I believe it's the RCV-M, and it's being plugged as the M5. And on the top, much like is shown in the clip, is a remote weapon station. He's driving on ice, and those don't look like ice tracks. Believe it or not, there is actually ways you can get more grip on a tracked vehicle on ice. It's anything from snow chains, that was used in World War II, to these days you can have grousers that you knock out a few track pads and you put basically cleats into the track. This thing is going quite fast, doing its various maneuvers on ice, and that's questionable in this context. I can think of no reason except for an accession to plot why a tank would have a grappling hook attached to it. The Lambo at the point that they connect is basically underwater, and that provides more drag than this thing can haul. Well, there's your point for realism. The door came off instead of the Lambo getting pulled out. I'm going to be generous. I'm going to give it 1 point because it has tracks, and I'm going to give it 1 point because it pulled the door instead of the whole Lambo. So I'm going to give it a 2. So you will have seen the Americans had somebody standing on the back firing the Caliber 50. The Caliber 50 was originally put onto American vehicles as an anti-aircraft weapon. And the reason that it's on that external mount at the back is that it's a lot easier to aim upwards if you're standing on the back deck and then aiming up, as opposed to trying to stick your head out of the hatch and maybe put it down from the side and you're not even able to use the sights. Sherman. One of the things Sherman was very good at was showing up when you needed a tank. And they tended not to go around in 1s and 2s, they tended to go around in 5s and 17s. Yeah, sure, on a tank-on-tank duel it wasn't necessarily the best. For an infantryman that's under heavy attack, he doesn't care if the best tank in the world shows up, as long as the tank which shows up, A, actually arrives, and B, is good enough to deal with whatever the infantryman's problem is. So you will notice that the Germans don't actually have any tanks, which was a problem that the Germans had in World War II, is that their industry simply wasn't up to the levels of American or Russian. So what we have here are a lot of assault guns and tank destroyers. That looks like a Marder there, or at least a representation of one. A Sturmgeschütz, which is an assault gun, and a Jagdpanther. The Jagdpanther is the only one that is the serious threat to an Allied vehicle. Why didn't the Jagdpanther just sit there and place its extremely tough frontal armor to the Shermans? Well, you could do that, but then you're probably now placing your weak flank armor to the American infantry, who are equipped in the scene with bazookas, anti-tank rocket launchers. The Germans are now outflanked, and so very sensibly they immediately abandon the attack and start falling back. This is as good as you're going to get on celluloid or on digits. If there is ever going to be a 10 for rate a tank battle, this is probably it. The tanks represent Saint-Chamond. There's only one that exists in the world. It's at the French National Tank Museum in Saumur. Now, the cognoscenti will look at the road wheels on that and realize that the vehicle is based off of a BMP or an MTLB, which are Soviet Cold War vehicles. By this point in the war, it's set, we're talking towards the end of 1918, the Germans are very familiar with tanks, but you'll still want to shoot them anyway for a couple of reasons. One is if the tanks are accompanying infantry, well, you're going to have an effect on the infantry and maybe suppress them to the point that the tanks are going to advance on their own. Secondly, the tanks were not the most robust at the time. There was a problem known as splash, especially in World War I. So tankers would actually wear a type chainmail in front of their face with goggles to stop the pieces of bullet coming in the gaps in the armor. Finally, it's psychological. It makes you feel a lot better to actually do something, even if it's a gesture of futility. The early tank guns for World War I were generally either being converted artillery pieces or quite often naval guns. The big problem you're going to have with getting up close is called depression. So there is a stop as to how far down the gun will depress, and that determines how close you can get to the enemy trench before you can have to stop engaging it. To this date, trench crossing ability in terms of meters, how many meters of trench you can cross, is still a criterion. The idea of can you cross it without collapsing it, well, that depends if you want to collapse it or not. So even as late as the Iraq campaigns, a tank would go up to fortified enemy position, turn on the spot and bury the people inside. And it's one of those unfortunate realities that basically tanks have many ways of killing you, and the tracks are one of them. You'd think today a hand grenade isn't going to do very much. The tracks on the Saint-Chamond were basically for my whole tractor. So they weren't as battle-proof as a modern vehicle would be. In fact, the armor on this is so thin that a lot of heavy bullets, they even developed rifle bullets with an armor-piercing core, could go through these early tanks. So this is an 8.5, maybe 9. I could quibble a few things, but it generally gets the concept across. Oh goody. So Rambo has gotten into his, I'm going to call it a T-72. It's not actually, but the helicopter here represents a Hind. I think it's actually a Puma. But the Hind, the Mi-24, was a gunship that still actually has the troop carrying capacity as well as carrying a lot of rockets and missiles and being heavily armored. It's basically a flying tank, for lack of a better term. So hang on, is he driving or is he gunning? There's only one tank that I can think of that is fully combat capable with one crewman, and that is the Swedish STRV-103, commonly known as the S-Tank. The driver functions as the gunner as well, and this is why you're supposed to go with anti-aircraft vehicles in company with you, because their job is to defend you against air threats. So our enemy is in an attack helicopter, a gunship, and it's got missiles on the tips, 82 Swatters probably, that are effective from several kilometers away. And instead he is firing unguided rockets at the front of the Rambo tank. Why doesn't he just fly around the back and shoot the rockets into the engine deck or the rear turret or some place that will actually cause damage? And so the enemy pilot dies the death that his stupidity deserved. Officially, if you must charge towards an aircraft, do it at an angle. He has to not only aim for lead, but also to change in distance at the same time. Whereas if you're charging straight at him, you're simplifying the problem for the aircraft that's coming at you. He doesn't need to worry about aiming. It has a tank, so I'll give it a 1. The premise of an ambush in an urban setting by armor
is not unheard of, but the idea of armor operating in an urban setting without infantry support is normally questionable. Panthers are not well suited for close range fighting. They really would excel on the eastern front, well, on the steppes of Ukraine, for example, with nice long lines of fire. That said, they can get away with it in this context because they know that the enemy is a single tank with no infantry. Oh look, he's going through a building again. Except this time he's done one thing right. He's got the turret traverse over the rear. I'd mentioned before you don't want to go through a building if you can avoid it. In this case, I guess they couldn't because they're getting shot at. And if you are going to go through, spin your turret over and you'll keep yourself safe. And what you can see here, the T-34-85 has a very neat traverse handle, so it performs two functions. In this case, you can see he has it in manual mode, cranking around, as opposed to electric mode, which you simply flip the handle 90 degrees. However, maybe the gunner just doesn't know this because in the movie, this was a found tank. Even myself, when I got into a T-34-85 for the first time and trying to see where is the second control handle, I can't find it. This is quite feasible. When faced with the Panther, this close-range T-34 crew now has a choice. It can either run away or it can attempt to engage. Now, I would probably agree with the 34 crew on this for two reasons. One, the Panther was looking the wrong way entirely. And the other thing is, Panthers are not the easiest thing in the world to kill unless you can get around the side or behind them. And in this case, they're already behind them. So why not engage? But the only thing I might have done differently was back up 2 or 3 tank lengths and aim the gun into the engine deck. That would be a more guaranteed kill than trying to aim for the turret ring. So the explosion was actually a little bit faster than would really happen. Generally speaking, when a tank is hit, it takes a couple of seconds, and those are your couple of seconds that is the difference between life and death when you're getting out of a vehicle. Although in reality, the net effect difference to the crew is academic. They're basically toast. In this context, I don't know, maybe a 7? The movie is set about the time of the Yemeni civil war, which is actually kind of still ongoing. The film was made in Morocco, hence you have the M60s and the T-72s. So the exact nature of the tanks that you get in Yemen isn't entirely there, but hey, for movie purposes, it gets the point across. Certainly there are Western and Eastern tanks in the area. So what I have here is a VIC-1 CVC, Combat Vehicle Crewman Helmet. And the reason you would want to wear a helmet even if you're inside the tank is quite simply you're being thrown around. And there's a lot of sharp, pointy things sticking out at you that as you're being thrown around, you don't want to hurt your head. And of course you also have the dust goggles. Because the tanks are throwing a lot of dust up at you. You don't have a windshield. If you're doing 40 miles an hour, there's still enough wind that you'll notice. So you wear a set of goggles as well. It's good to see armor actually work. So what has happened there is a round hit explosive reactive armor. So those bricks that you see, what they generally consist of, though this is a gross oversimplification, is a couple of pieces of metal sandwiching a piece of explosive. That when a round hits it, it explodes and disrupt or destabilize it to the extent that the main armor belt behind can stop it. You got a couple of problems. Firstly, if the entire turret system is offline, then the tank is still rocking a little bit. It may not look at much, but it's going to be rocking enough that you cannot hip shoot a 125 on a point target like a tank like that. Secondly, he literally is hip shooting and he's eyeballing it. I don't see why he couldn't still be using the gun sight. He can then pull the trigger himself.
Sandstorms do happen. In the 2003 invasion of Iraq, there was one that basically shut down the war for a couple of days. Well, your big problem with a sandstorm is the air filters. So the sand is going to get into your air filters and clog them up very quickly. However, in this context, I don't think they had a heck of a lot of choice, because being chased by a platoon of M60s, they were probably going to die anyway. So why not make for the sandstorm and hope for the best? So I think 7's probably fair. I'm not even sure where to start. I'm trying to think of any reasonable military context that this vehicle could exist in. The US Army has a vehicle, the M1117, which is a derivative of the old LAV 100s from Vietnam. It's basically a huge armored 4x4 with a gun turret on the top for military police use. I'm sure they wouldn't mind something like this. So generally speaking, convoys, just because of the nature of roads, you tend to be in column instead of line abreast like in the shot here. You have a bit of a choice, depending on how many vehicles you have, as how far apart you want the vehicles to be. Because the idea is that your lead vehicle is going to be sufficiently far in front of whatever it is that you're protecting, the main body of the convoy. So with only 3 vehicles, you're kind of limited as to what you can do. But your typical is going to be maybe 2 up front, then the main asset, and then 1 bringing up the rear. Cannons are not common, but they are a thing. You can sometimes find them mounted as experiments on tanks as well, but they're basically a waste of space and weight, so you don't see them on tanks. In terms of the missile launcher, yeah, missile launchers on armored cars are a thing. This particular elevating out of the 4x4 is probably closer to a BRDM anti-tank system, but that's actually for anti-armor purposes, not anti-aircraft. But hey, well, I guess when you're dealing with Batman, anything goes. I got nothing. The 0, sorry, no.
Ceasefire, target destroyed.
The Germans appear to be equipped with PaK-40s. It was a very good anti-tank gun, 7.5 centimeter caliber, definitely a valid threat against an M4.
Anti-tank, AT, trash left.
Submerge left!
That was a doctrinal fire command. Now, the reason I know this is they actually sent me the script before filming. But that is basically alert, target, and command of execution, an abbreviated fire command. The fire commands back in World War II weren't quite as regimented as they are today, but the fundamentals are actually still the same. You have an argument, do you want to advance over open ground as a whole platoon, or do you want to bound in sections? In this case, because of the amount of infantry that they're trying to provide cover for, I can see perhaps why they went as a full platoon online. But also it's a very, very open, long field, so maybe it was necessary for the entire platoon to advance online, simply so that they could see the target.
Who's got eyes on it?
Somebody's going to ask, how can a PaK-40 miss at such short range? You will be surprised what stress is going to do to you. So there have been studies, and the reputation of the 88 is such that it doesn't miss. In reality, they're firing 20 rounds to get a single kill, because the stress of combat is such that it is not calm and collected on a gunnery range when you're doing scientific testing. It's, oh God, I'm about to die.
Let's light him up. Let's go. Let's clean it up.
Now that scene is basically why I became a tanker. A line of tanks, every machine gun going. A single tank is considered to have firepower more or less equivalent to an infantry platoon, because you have the heavy machine gun up top, you got a coax machine gun, you got a bow machine gun, and oh, by the way, you've got a cannon. That is a lot of firepower from a single vehicle. You can imagine the sheer suppression and psychological effect that comes of this, let alone the lethal effects. I know there were folks that didn't like that I gave The Last Fury a 9, but I'm giving this one a 9 as well.
Can't get elevation, he knows it.
So this was an actual problem in Afghanistan, and it's a mountainous country, is that their tanks, which were designed really for open warfare on the plains of Germany, can't elevate high enough. So what the Soviets ended up doing was they developed a variant of the ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft gun, the Shilka, called the Afghanit. So they would use those in conjunction with the tanks to provide that close range, high elevation security that Daskal here is having a problem with. The actual effect of hitting the gun tube is not going to be the pedaling like you see here. That's for visual effect. What you're actually going to get is a very small hole that goes through the gun tube, but it's still plenty bad enough that you've disabled the gun. The grenade will not have separated the tracks, so I must conclude it was the rocks, but it's not impossible for rocky terrain and maybe a less experienced driver to angle his track in such a way when he's turning that he gets rocks caught in between the wheels and the tracks and snaps the track pin, and that throws your track and loses it. This scene is probably a 7 to an 8. So out of the clips that we saw today, if I had to recommend one and one only to watch, I'd probably go with Band of Brothers, which is more of an infantry related show, but tanks work with the infantry, and it's always good to understand it. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you found it interesting and informative. If you want more of the same sort of thing, add one form, Travis Wright, and click the video in that box.